Hey guys, Tyler Ansman here with Tyler Ansman Performance. So one of the things that we've talked about in the past are, health and elbow injuries, and rightfully so, right? It's an important topic. We're seeing kind of a lot of those, right? Especially in big name guys right now. So one of the things that we're going to get into today is how do we kind of go about maintaining health the best we possibly can. So we've talked about in the past, we want to monitor throwing load. That's probably the single biggest thing that most people get wrong. We've talked about that. We've talked about, in some cases, changing the throwing pattern to make it a little bit more efficient. Talked about that. All right, today we're going to get a little bit more granular and talk about kind of forearm training and what this means, looks like, how do we fit this in, and why does it actually matter. So first, a little bit of a background here. So when we think about what does the forearm actually do, let's think about kind of the UCL first. So when the arm goes from cocking to acceleration right before max layback, so kind of picture Billy Wagner with his arm parallel to the ground, that's basically max layback. So kind of right before that happens, when the arm transitions from cocking to acceleration, what we're seeing is we get the maximum kind of valgus load here, right? So this is where the kind of main passive stabilizer is the anterior band of the UCL, all right? And so what that kind of means is it kind of like, it does the best it can to kind of keep that gap that grows between kind of the ulna and the humerus from growing so great that the arm essentially comes apart. Like if you want to like way oversimplify it, it's basically holding the arm together, okay? And so what we see is during a pitch, we get between 60 and 120 Newton meters of force, depending on a variety of factors, that happen. And we know from cadaveric studies that the UCL on its own can't kind of stabilize that amount of valgus force. So what else is happening? Well, this is kind of where the forearm and kind of the muscles around the elbow come into play in terms of kind of helping stabilize during this portion of the throw. So the flexor pronator group is kind of one of the main stabilizers during kind of this valgus loading, all right? And so we know it could take some of that load off of the UCL, so it's not stabilizing that 60 to 120 Newton meters by itself. But then we also have the extensor supinator group, and then the elbow kind of flexors and extensors, so the biceps brachii and the triceps brachii. And so what we're kind of seeing is, based on kind of the forward dynamic modeling that we've seen, the biceps, triceps, and the kind of extensor supinator mass are having a more like indirect effect. But what we've seen is when we activate those muscles, especially the biceps and triceps, that gapping that occurs at the medial elbow, right, when that valgus stress is occurring, the kind of that pulling apart that we discussed, it's lessened when those muscles are activated. So it seems like they're a little bit more indirect than the direct effect that the flexor pronator group is having, but still relevant. All right, and so then we also have seen in the research that grip strength has a pretty direct correlation in a couple of ways. So one, it seems to correlate relatively well with velocity. It also correlates relatively well with health, okay? And so what we kind of see is, post-pitching, it takes a little bit of time for the strength of these forearm muscles to kind of return to their baseline. And so, it's different for different guys, depends on how many pitches you've thrown, relative strength numbers, how hard you're throwing, all of those kinds of things. But certainly we're seeing that 24 hours after, not only has the strength in those forearm muscles not returned to their baseline, also the elasticity levels haven't returned to baseline. So what does this mean? It means essentially if we're going to throw during that time period, that we're likely putting more loading on our UCL than we would if we were kind of fully returned to that baseline. So this clearly means we have a need to kind of train our forearms and all of those kind of muscles around the elbows. But how do we fit this in so we're not getting that same fatiguing effect that we're seeing post-throwing with the training of it, right? We don't want to blow up our forearms and then expect that we're going to be able to go throw at our peak and have it all kind of turn out well, right? Because we don't want that fatigue creeping into kind of the forearms when they're meant to be stabilizing our UCL and kind of these other passive pieces. Okay, so in the off season, or a period of the off season where throwing is less, whether it's a deload, time completely off, whatever it is, we can be a bit more aggressive with our forearm trainings. This might be kind of a time where you're training these kind of movements that we're going to go over later, 3 times a week. All right, we can load them a bit more aggressively, and we can do it with more volume than we're going to be able to during periods of higher throwing. all right? During periods of higher throwing, we have to be a little bit more careful with kind of how we're placing this within our microcycles, okay? So we know from Dr. Keith Barr's research that collagen synthesis peaks about every 6 hours, all right? And so we also want to kind of be thinking about this when we're training for specific health purposes like we're discussing today, all right? So we don't want to do this right after a throwing session, right? We probably want to do this in the case of like when we get into periods of higher throwing. What we'll typically do is we'll have guys do this generally the day after, or certainly at least 6 hours after they've thrown hard. Generally, it works out to be the next day just for timing purposes, especially if they're coming off of an outing. And so what we'll typically do is not only will we do that at that specific time, we'll also supplement collagen and vitamin C to kind of maximize the effect as much as we can while we're doing this. And so as with anything else in the weight room, we want to think about kind of progressively overloading these things. And so what we're going to do, we're going to train through a few different ranges of motion. So we hit all of the relevant kind of musculature discussed today. And we want to train them kind of at their end ranges where they're going to be, you know, kind of the worst at doing their jobs. All right. And so what we're going to do is we'll kind of start with isometrics. Then we'll start with kind of slower tempo stuff. And then we can get more aggressive with our loading. This would be where you could kind of do like your supramaximal eccentrics and those kinds of things. Again, that is probably not a modality that's going to work super well during a period of higher throwing unless you're very, very well trained already and we're very careful about our timing. But that's something we can kind of get into in a little bit. But that's kind of how we'll progress these things. Now let's get into the demo. All right, so kind of the first thing would be kind of getting a baseline. So one of these handheld dynamometers will work, right? We'll test your grip strength there. We can just do it very basically. We could get way more into the weeds with some various grips and things like that. But for now, we'll start there. So this would be something you'd want to monitor likely every week as you kind of go, and you'll probably see fluctuations as you go if you're kind of noticing it around, you know, periods of higher throwing or lower throwing. All right, so that'd be the first thing, kind of testing that. Then from there, what are the various movements we're going to do? So the first one, you could do this, you could have a PVC that you load like quarters or nickels to on the end. You can do any number of things. You could also do an overcoming instead of yielding variation, which I'll talk about at the end. But so what we're going to do is we'll do ulnar deviation first. So think about, you're going to go pinky to forearm, and we would just hold this. Generally, we would start with 30 seconds. And then we would go radial deviation right here, and we would hold that for 30 seconds. That would be kind of the first one. So if you didn't have a heavy enough object, you could find something to push up into, like if you had a bat or something along those lines, something to push up into where it was at end range, where you were holding that the entire time against something for like 30 seconds going at 75% or so effort. So that would be true for all of these things. So next, we would go pronation and supination. So we're going to take your wrist kind of just inside your elbow, be right here, and you would hold this position as far as you could go for about 30 seconds. We would do the same the other direction for 30 seconds, right? So pronation and supination isos would be kind of your second ones. All right, after that, we're going to go elbow extension iso. So we'll go just beyond 90 degrees. Probably easier if I go from this side. We'll go just beyond 90 degrees, and we'll hold that again for about 30 seconds. All right. After that, we'll hit elbow flexion pretty close to end range. All right. So we'll go mostly extended. So at my armpit, I'll be supported up here. I'll have as neutral of a wrist as I can. Don't want to be here kind of hanging out in super valgus, all right? Again, a progression we could get to down the line. We could be a little bit more aggressive with that, but not at the moment. We'll be mostly extended. You'll hold that, again, for about 30 seconds, all right? And then we would get out of that. And then the final one we're going to do is wrist and finger flexion and extension isos. So what you would do here is you could pick a band, all right? Want to have this control the resistance here. Again, my wrist is going to be just inside my elbow. I'm going to get this out of my fingers so I get those deep finger flexors as well, and everything I'm just going to hold extended, all right? Then likely you'll have to loosen it a little bit, but we're going to do the same thing. Get those finger extensors as well as the forearm extensors, all right? And so that's kind of where we would go. And again, we could progress this loading as we go through this, but that would be for a video kind of down the line. Won't get there today. This is where I would start in terms of the isometrics. So again, if you want to throw hard, you want to be healthy, we need to at least kind of check up on those forearms and likely kind of add some training in that you're probably not already getting, but we want to be careful about how we pick our spots. Thanks for watching. If you got questions or comments, feel free to drop them below or shoot me an email. Thanks.